Hi, everyone. A number of you reached out to me to ask my opinion about the inspection report from 2024 that was finally released by Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority on July 10th, 2026. I'm recording this video on July 18th, and I have a number of observations that I'd like to bring to you today. So, for those of you who may not be familiar with this bridge in Rhode Island, it's the Mount Hope Bridge. It goes from Bristol to Portsmouth, Rhode Island, the East Bay. Bridge construction started in 1927 and was completed in October 1929. So, it's a nearly 100-year-old bridge. It serves the East Bay of Rhode Island, has an average traffic volume of around 18,000 vehicles a day. A much lesser traffic volume than, say, the Washington Bridge. Nonetheless, it's a very important bridge to the people of Rhode Island. The bridge has a deck height of 135 feet above Narragansett Bay. The main span length is 1,200 feet. The overall length of the bridge is 6,130 feet. Now, there's been quite the saga of making this 2024 routine inspection report available to the public, and there's been a lot of great coverage that's been done by Tim White of WPRI, as well as East Bay, Rhode Island. So to give you the bottom line up front, my reaction to this inspection report and the events surrounding it is that I saw nothing in this 2024 inspection report that would make me reluctant to drive across this bridge. However, there's a couple of important caveats to this inspection report. First of all, it did not include an internal inspection of the wires making up the main cables for the suspension bridge. That's an important factor here. The last time that inspection was done, a small percentage of those wires in these cables was inspected in 2015. Overall, the bridge has a rating of fair condition, and that's dictated by the lower condition rating of the bridge substructure. And the last time the bridge substructure was inspected, according to my research, was 2023. So it's important to note that the Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority have not released this underwater inspection report, nor have they released any inspection reports prior to 2024. Well, given that it took a lawsuit by the town of Bristol filed against Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority, as well as the TSA, for the release of this 2024 inspection report, the Rhode Island Transit Bridge Authority has not been transparent about the information that they have about this bridge, the condition of the bridge, and what they're doing to maintain the safety and serviceability of this bridge. Now, in order to hide this inspection report from the public, they classified it as Sensitive Security Information, SSI, which is a designation that allows the report to be withheld from the public. And that appears to have been an inappropriate classification. I can tell you my review of this report indicates that there was nothing in there that would support that classification. In other words, there was no aha moment where a bad actor would see something in this report and say, well, that's what I need to focus on. The risks to the suspension bridge or a bridge like this are readily apparent to anybody with a modicum of common sense and experience. So for them to use this as an excuse, the SSI classification, is just a blatant lack of transparency. And I think, in my opinion, the reason why they tried to keep this report from the public is that it reflects poorly on Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority's ability to effectively manage these bridge assets that they're responsible for. It's an embarrassment, quite frankly, given the condition of this bridge and some of the deficiencies that were noted in this inspection report. And I think they just didn't want to have to explain how the bridge got to be this way. It's unacceptable. Many of the things that were noted in this inspection report doesn't mean the bridge is unsafe to drive across. It just means the time that this bridge can remain in service reliably is unfortunately, I think, rather short, but I'll come back to that. Now, right now, there's a $48 million contract that's underway with Kiewit Infrastructure to install a main cable dehumidification system. This system is designed to prevent additional corrosion and breakage of the internal wires that make up the suspension cables. As part of this contract, there's to be a detailed inspection of these internal wire strands. It's a quite tedious and labor intensive process, and it's not something that is routine. And I suspect the reason why this type of inspection wasn't done in 2024 is they knew it would be part of their planned dehumidification project. So the last time this type of inspection has been performed is 2015. And in Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority's grant application to the federal government seeking funding for this dehumidification project, they made it quite clear that the condition of these cables was rapidly deteriorating, and without the intervention of this dehumidification project, the bridge was at significant risk of not having adequate factors of safety for these suspension cables to maintain traffic on the bridge. Now, Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority has confused the public, in my opinion, by telling people that this dehumidification project will lead to an additional 50 to 75 years of service life for the bridge. That's clearly not true. Now, it may lead to that extended lifespan for the suspension cables themselves, assuming that corrosion and breakage hasn't gotten to the point where the dehumidification project will be somewhat superfluous, in that if enough deterioration has occurred, they need to be replacing these cables. Currently, there's no plans for the replacement of the Mount Hope Bridge, but it should be readily apparent by looking at the condition documented in this inspection report from 2024 that there's significant deterioration for major aspects of this bridge. Add to that the fact that the bridge is functionally obsolete. It's a narrow bridge. The 2 lanes cover a width of 28 feet. The load rating's quite low at 30 tons. There's no bike or pedestrian crossing on the bridge. It's past its prime, way past its prime. It's not a suspension bridge in the same league as, say, the Golden Gate Bridge or the George Washington Bridge in New York. And I think it's just well past its point of a reliable extension of its service life, much beyond the present day. And the main reason for this is that it's apparent that Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority simply doesn't have sufficient funding on an annual basis to keep up with the required repair and maintenance for this bridge. Instead, they rely on a crisis management style, in my opinion, that involves waiting for something to get so bad that it requires an emergency repair, or that there's a sufficient number of things that are needed that are perhaps not an emergency, but enough in number that they could be bundled together as part of a capital improvement project, in which case Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority goes out and seeks federal grants or gets the state to sell bonds to finance these capital improvement projects. So this crisis management style leaves them vulnerable to having a confluence of events or conditions with the bridge that results in the bridge perhaps being one inspection away from an emergency closure. So at the end of this video, I'm going to offer my opinion about what needs to be done to address the needs of the public for the Mount Hope Bridge and other bridges under the authority of Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority. So let's get back to the specifics of this 2024 inspection report. It was performed by a company called Attain, and they collected a fee, according to my research, of $177,000 to perform this inspection. This inspection was performed from October 23rd to November 22nd, 2024, and it was a pretty detailed inspection, as you would expect. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it did not include any aspects of underwater inspection for the condition of the substructure, nor did it include an invasive or any type of internal inspection of the wire strands for the main suspension cables. And let's just go through examples of some of the major deterioration that was noted. I mean, it may not preclude the ability for traffic to safely cross the bridge, but it's just a terrible state of affairs. And you just have to wonder, at what point does this type of deterioration just get completely out of hand or combined to lead major aspects of this bridge unusable? Just holes through structural steel members. And this has taken years to develop. This isn't something that's occurred between 2-year inspection cycles. And just by looking at the outside of the wires, they have observed a significant amount of corrosion. Now, just to go over some of the main components of a suspension bridge, you have these suspension cables that are made up of a few thousand individual wire strands that go across the pylons, the towers on the bridge, and are anchored into concrete anchor blocks. And from the main suspension cables, you have these suspender cables that connect the bridge deck to the suspension cables. Now, there were a number of deficiencies noted in this inspection report that were characterized as PR, priority repair. I think there were 21 of them, in fact. Now, I'll note that when Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority released this report on Friday, July 10th, and you see that often with public agencies who have tried to avoid public disclosure, they'll do a document dump on a Friday, hoping that the information slowly trickles out over the weekend to a limited degree. And by the following week, most people have moved on. But when Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority released this report, they did so without any explanation. I know they met with that East Bay media outlet 2 days before they released the report, going over some of the key aspects. So I think they knew they were going to be having to release that report a few days later, and they were trying to get ahead of some of the main aspects of the report. But again, they didn't provide any specifics about what they had done to address these deficiencies, what the timeline was, how these deficiencies got to be present to the degree that they are documented in the report. But as I mentioned, the bridge has an overall rating of fair. Now let's get into the main cables for the suspended spans. The main cables consist of 2,450 parallel wires divided into 7 strands of 350 wires each. And this report references the fact that the internal inspection was last performed in 2015. As I mentioned, Kiewit has this $48 million contract to install the suspension cable dehumidification system, as well as to do an internal inspection on a percentage of the wire strands making up the suspension cables. This contract was awarded in the fall of 2025, and the expected completion date is December 2027. This is a picture of a dehumidification project for another bridge, but the basis of the system is to blow dry air through these suspension cables, and you contain the air with an enclosure or wrapping around the wires, and you have a plant room, usually in the anchorage houses, to condition the air and pump it through the cable system. The goal of these dehumidification systems is to bring the relative humidity to below 40%, at which point no further corrosion occurs. And the condition of the wires documented in the report use this rating system of 1 to 4, with I guess 5, if you want to call it that, being broken. And there were many wires noted to be in condition 3 or 4. So well on their way to becoming broken with additional deterioration. Now, back in the 2015 internal wire inspection, Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority had to reduce the safety factor for the suspension cables. Originally, that safety factor was computed to be 2.95. So in other words, the suspension cables had nearly 3 times greater capacity than the loads that were required to be carried by the suspension of the bridge deck, as well as traffic and all the other loading. And as a result of this 2015 inspection, they estimated that that safety factor had dropped to 2.62, and the lower bound, the lowest permissible value for that safety factor, is 2.15. And Rhode Island Transit Bridge Authority acknowledged that they could end up with a safety factor lower than 2.15 in a matter of just a few years if this dehumidification system isn't implemented, as well as They still have to do the internal inspection to make sure that corrosion hasn't resulted in a lowering of the factor of safety below an acceptable limit. This is a photo from another project showing inspection of these internal wire strands for these suspension cables, where they insert plastic blocks to separate these wire strands to inspect their condition. It's quite a slow and tedious process. Now, the Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority is a quasi-public agency, and you do have the head of Rhode Island DOT as one of the board members, ex officio. So Rhode Island DOT does have responsibility for the oversight, the inspection, and maintenance of these bridges. The lead responsibility is with Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority, but ultimately it's the state of Rhode Island that's responsible for maintaining these bridges. And I think one of the reasons a lot of people have questioned the safety of this bridge is because of serviceability problems that they observe in their traveling over the bridge. The surface condition of the bridge deck is just horrible. Now, there are plans to replace the bridge deck at some point. They just did a temporary resurfacing project last year, and it was supposed to take 4 days. I think they did it in August of 2025, which I thought they would have done it a little bit later in the year because of the impacts to summer traffic would have been less if they had pushed it off another month. But they planned a 4-day closure of the bridge and was bragging how they only needed about a day and a half, I think it was, or 2 days, and finished about 2 days ahead of schedule. And from what I understand, this surface redo of the bridge deck didn't last very long at all. It's already falling apart. So episodes like that don't really boost the public's confidence in the Rhode Island Transit Bridge Authority's ability to really administer needed repair and maintenance of bridges like the Mount Hope Bridge, in my opinion. And the Mount Hope Bridge is just one of 4 bridges in the inventory. I'm just focusing on Mount Hope Bridge for this video. So to summarize, there's a lot of excessive deterioration of this bridge, and the age and condition of the bridge as it exists now is going to result in, I think, the loss of serviceability for this bridge in just a few years, unless there's a massive intervention beyond this dehumidification project. And I haven't seen any publicly released information about a series of capital improvement projects to seriously extend the life of this bridge a few more decades. I think this bridge is on a path of having maybe only 5 or 10 more years of useful service life if a major intervention isn't implemented here. And I guess the other question is, why would you want this bridge in service another 10 years when ultimately it needs to be replaced? I mean, that might be the realistic time frame to get a new bridge built, but without any stated plans for a bridge replacement, it isn't clear to me how long Rhode Island Transit Bridge Authority realistically expects the Mount Hope Bridge to remain in service. There's an old expression that hope is not a plan. So what do I think needs to be done? Big picture here. I think we've seen a number of instances already where the executive branch of Rhode Island state government is not up to the task of properly maintaining public infrastructure, bridges in particular. We just saw a recent example back in April where a 100-foot long parapet wall fell off a bridge in Cranston and crashed down on the Amtrak lines, the active lines. Fortunately, no trains were passing at the time. This day, nearly 3 months later, there's been no explanation from Rhode Island DOT about specifically what happened to cause this failure that could have been a real disaster. Of course, I've done over 50 videos about the ongoing saga with the westbound Washington Bridge. So transparency is not the strong suit of Rhode Island officials when it comes to bridge infrastructure, in my opinion. And I think it's going to take some intervention, more intervention by the state legislature. I think it's been inadequate so far. There's been various attempts. It took 3 hearings for the 3rd hearing finally on the westbound Washington Bridge fiasco to start exposing some of the real deficiencies with Rhode Island DOT director at the time, Peter Alviti. I think the first 2 hearings were a complete waste of time. The 3rd hearing, where they brought in a former federal prosecutor, I think had a big influence on then Director Alviti subsequently resigning back in February of 2026. But then it was just dropped. There were many follow-up items that could have been pursued, in my opinion, to get into how Rhode Island DOT is administered. So in a similar fashion, I think such legislative scrutiny needs to be applied to Rhode Island Transit and Bridge Authority. I think they need to convene an independent panel of engineers and related experts to look at the condition of these bridges, to plan what type of repair and maintenance programs are needed, what type of capital improvement projects are needed, what kind of replacement plans are needed in some cases. And I think that applies to the Mount Hope Bridge for sure. But I don't think there's much time in Rhode Island to continue allowing business as usual to play out with these bridges like the Mount Hope Bridge. I think the state of Rhode Island's running out of time. This bridge is in fair condition, but there's a number of aspects to this bridge that have deterioration that you wouldn't want to see on any bridge, and really can't be excused by saying, well, yeah, it's nearly 100 years old. What do you expect? Time is catching up with this bridge, and I don't think the funding of Rhode Island Transit Bridge Authority is at all adequate to address these needs, and I don't think their management is up to the task either, given how they've handled these past issues, and particularly their efforts to withhold this 2024 inspection report from the public. So I'll continue to follow developments with the Mount Hope Bridge. I appreciate all of you reaching out to me, and of course there'll be further updates on the Washington Bridge in Providence. With that, I've got a quick book mention today. Charles Dickens' Hard Times. I've been reading a lot of Victorian era books. I really enjoyed this one, and saw a lot of parallels with just the whole oligarchy at that time, and how it could be applied to AI in today's environment, and just what the mindset was between the workers and the people that own the means of production. It's a very interesting book. It's the first Dickens book that I've read. Surprisingly, I don't think I read any in high school. I read mostly Russian and French authors in high school, I think. But I really like his writing style. So if you're so inclined, I've got a link in the description. With that, I want to send a shout out to those of you who've contributed to Buy Me a Coffee. That's an excellent way to support this channel. I also want to thank the channel members who typically preview these videos a day or more in advance. And I also want to thank those of you who've contributed to Super Thanks. So stay tuned, everyone.